some stories take 40 years to tell properly, not because the truth was impossible to find, but because the tools to find it didn't exist yet, because a 15-year-old girl was murdered in 1982, and the science that would eventually name her killer wouldn't be available for decades, because one detective refused to let her file gather dust, and because a retired exterminator living quietly in Maui had no idea that the world had finally caught up with him. This is the story of Karen Stitt, and of the man who spent 5 years hunting her killer across 4 decades, a family tree, and 2 Hawaiian islands. Karen Ann Stitt was 15 years old in the fall of 1982. She recently moved to Palo Alto, California, with her father and brother. A new city, a new school, a new beginning. By every account, she was exactly the kind of teenager who made an impression. Bright, kind, with a big smile and a love of rock music. Her Aunt Robin later described her simply as wonderful. Karen was bright and kind and beautiful, she said, the kind of person you don't forget. Karen had a boyfriend, a teenage boy named David Woods, who lived in Sunnyvale, the neighboring city. On the evening of Thursday, September 2nd, 1982, Karen took a bus from Palo Alto to Sunnyvale to visit him. They spent the evening together. Around midnight, David walked her toward the bus stop at El Camino Real and Wolf Road so she could ride home. He was worried about getting in trouble for being out past curfew, so he ran back to his house after watching her walk in the direction of the stop. He never saw her again. The next morning, a delivery truck driver found Karen's body approximately 100 yards from the bus stop. She had been hidden behind a blood-stained cinder block wall. Her arms and legs were bound with her own clothing. Her personal belongings, makeup, small items from her bag, were scattered around her. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed 59 times. Detective Matt Hutchison, who would take on the case decades later, stood at that crime scene and described what he saw in language that stayed with him for the rest of his career. There was blood on the wall behind her body, and then, up above her, there was more blood on top of the wall. It's certainly the most graphic and violent scene I've seen in my career as a police officer and firefighter. In 1982, Karen Stitt was 15 years old and completely alone in the dark, and someone had done this to her. The investigation that followed was extensive by any measure. Police interviewed witnesses. They canvassed the neighborhood. They worked every lead they had. And almost immediately, suspicion fell on the most obvious person, David Woods, her boyfriend, the last person to see her alive, the teenager who had walked her toward the bus stop and run home. He maintained from the beginning that he had nothing to do with what happened to Karen, that he had said goodbye to her, watched her walk away, and gone home, that he had no idea what had happened in the 100 yards between where he last saw her and where her body was found. Police could not prove otherwise, but they couldn't clear him either. Without definitive evidence pointing elsewhere, David Woods remained under a cloud of suspicion that would follow him for years. The investigation stalled. The years passed. The file sat in a cabinet in the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety, growing older. No arrest, no charges, no answers for Karen's family. In the early 2000s, investigators revisited the case with early DNA technology. The killer had left biological evidence at the scene, both blood and bodily fluid. That evidence had been preserved. When it was tested, the results were definitive about one thing. David Woods had not killed Karen Stitt. His DNA did not match. He was cleared. After nearly 20 years of quiet suspicion, David Woods was finally exonerated by the science that hadn't existed when Karen died. But clearing the innocent man was only half the work. The other half, finding the guilty one, was still undone. The file went back into the cabinet. Detective Matt Hutchison joined the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety Cold Case Unit and took on Karen's case in 2017. He later described his approach simply, "This case had to be solved." It wasn't a question of whether. It was a question of how. He was working at a moment when forensic science was undergoing something close to a revolution. In 2018, investigators in a different California case had used a technique called forensic genealogy, also called genetic genealogy, to identify the Golden State Killer, one of the most notorious unsolved serial killers in American history. The technique worked by uploading crime scene DNA to genealogical databases, finding distant relatives whose DNA partially matched, and then building out family trees by hand to identify the likely source of the original DNA. It was painstaking, it was time-consuming, and it worked. Hutchison began applying the same approach to Karen's case. In early 2019, a tip came in, the kind of tip that cold case detectives live for. Someone with knowledge of the case indicated that Karen's killer was likely one of 4 brothers from Fresno, California. 4 brothers. It was a starting point, not an answer. Hutchison didn't know which brother. He didn't have their names. He had a direction. He began to work. Using newspaper obituaries, public records databases, and social media, Facebook posts, family announcements, the ordinary digital footprint that people leave without thinking, Hutchison traced the family. He built out the tree. He identified the 4 brothers. He located their relatives. In 2021, a genealogist working with the investigation formally narrowed the biological evidence to the family, one of 4 brothers. But which one? Hutchison tracked down one of Gary Ramirez's daughters, who was living in Southern California. Without her knowledge, investigators collected a DNA sample from her trash, from discarded items she had thrown away, not knowing anyone was watching. The sample was tested. The result came back with a high probability match. The DNA found at Karen Stitt's crime scene was consistent with being the biological father of this woman. On April 8, 2022, Hutchison obtained a formal DNA sample from the daughter. The Santa Clara County DA's crime lab ran the comparison. Hutchison was in a hotel when the email arrived with the results. He later described that moment. He said he wanted to scream, but couldn't because he didn't want to wake anyone in the hotel. So he sat quietly for a moment. Then he opened his laptop and found Karen's photograph. He looked at her face, the bright smile, the rock t-shirts, the 15-year-old girl from Palo Alto, and he said quietly, "We did it." Gary Jean Ramirez was 75 years old and living in Makawao on the island of Maui, Hawaii. He had grown up in Fresno. He had served in the United States Air Force in the early 1970s. After leaving the military, he had moved around the Bay Area, San Francisco, San Diego, Colorado, Hawaii. He had worked for years as a pest exterminator. He had no criminal record. His older brother Rudy, who also lived in Maui, told reporters he couldn't imagine his younger brother doing anything like this. "I've never seen him violent or get angry ever," Rudy said. "He wouldn't hurt a fly." In August 2022, 40 years after Karen Stitt was killed, law enforcement arrived at Gary Ramirez's home in Maui. The operation to arrest him had taken months of planning and coordination between Santa Clara County, Maui law enforcement, and federal authorities. It had been funded in part by a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice specifically for cold case investigations. When detectives arrested him, Gary Ramirez appeared stunned. All he could say, according to Detective Hutchison, was, "Oh my gosh." He was extradited to California and arraigned on charges of murder, kidnapping, and rape. Investigators confirmed that his DNA matched the blood and bodily fluid left at Karen Stitt's crime scene, the same biological evidence that had been collected in 1982, preserved for 40 years, and finally matched to the right person. In February 2025, Gary Ramirez pleaded no contest to first-degree murder. On May 12, 2025, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison with the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available given his age of 78. He was 35 years old in 1982 when he encountered a 15-year-old girl walking alone toward a bus stop at midnight. He was 78 years old when he sat in a California courtroom and heard his sentence. In between, 40 years of ordinary life, a job, a family, a retirement in Hawaii, a brother who said he wouldn't hurt a fly. Karen Stitt's family was in the courtroom for the sentencing. Her aunt Robin Morris, who had loved her niece, who had grieved her for more than 4 decades, sat and listened. She had described Karen as bright and kind and beautiful. She had waited 40 years to be in that room. A prosecutor who had worked the case said, "There will never be true justice because Karen cannot and will not come back." That is true. No sentence brings her back. No conviction restores what was taken on that sidewalk in Sunnyvale on the night of September 2nd, 1982. But the Santa Clara County District Attorney stood before cameras after the arrest and said something worth holding on to. Behind every old murder file in every major police department, there is a person, heartbreak, and a mystery. The mystery of Karen Stitt's death has been solved thanks to advances in forensic science and a detective that would never, ever give up. The technique that solved Karen's case, forensic genealogy, family tree DNA, the patient reconstruction of bloodlines from discarded trash and obituary notices and Facebook posts, is now being used on cold cases across the country. Cases from the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, when there were no databases, no genetic mapping, no way to trace a stranger's DNA through a family tree. Cases where killers walked away, believing they had left nothing behind that could ever find them. They were wrong. They were just right about the timing. The science wasn't ready yet. It is now. Karen Stitt was 15 years old. She had a big smile and wore rock t-shirts and had recently moved to a new city where she was just starting to build a life. She took a bus to visit her boyfriend on a September evening and never made it home. 40 years later, Detective Matt Hutchison opened a photo on his laptop in a hotel room and told her, "We did it." She deserved to hear that. She deserved it decades earlier. Better late than never is a cold comfort. But in a case like this, it is also the only comfort there is.